Okay, so you know how we love to really dig into a topic here, pull back the curtain, and today, well, we are tackling something that I think a lot of people are really interested in,
Yeah.
and that is the world of sourdough.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And I think there's probably a lot of people out there, maybe you're one of them, who are either already kind of knee-deep in sourdough, wrestling with hydration levels and all that, or maybe you're just,
Just starting out.
just starting out.
Curious.
Yeah, or maybe you're just curious about what makes that incredible tang.
Absolutely.
So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a deep dive, and we've got some really cool sources
You do?
to help us really understand sourdough. So hopefully you walk away from this,
A little bit more confident in the kitchen.
yeah, a little more confident, a little more knowledgeable.
Yeah, I think that's the goal. Sourdough, I think, has this kind of like
Enchant.
enchanting, almost mythical quality to it. It's like, oh, it's this mysterious thing. And we've pulled together a bunch of different sources to kind of demystify it, really give you the tools to understand not just, okay, this is what happens, but this is why it happens.
Yeah, and it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, we were just talking before we started, sourdough,
It goes way back.
it's been around since ancient Egypt.
1500 BC, can you imagine?
That's incredible, 1500 BC. That's not just a tradition, that's like,
It's the foundation of bread as we know it.
yeah.
I mean, it really, really, really is. And for so long, until you get to like the late 1800s, like the late 19th century when commercial yeast became a thing, sourdough wasn't a specialized technique or something that, a few bakers were doing.
Right.
It was how bread was made.
Yeah.
It was the fundamental, like,
For everyone.
leavening, for
centuries.
generations and generations of bakers.
And then there's this like incredible link to the San Francisco Gold Rush
Of 1849.
1849. Like I always picture those prospectors heading out west, and they've got their little sourdough starter, right?
That's
Right,
right.
this little piece of home, and that's what's keeping them fed.
It is. And it's funny because you think about it now, and we've got, instant yeast, we've got all these different things. But back then, that sourdough starter was a lifeline.
It was.
It was reliable. You could take it with you. It could survive those journeys.
And it adapted, right?
It did.
Like it took on the character of San Francisco. I mean, that's
Well, that's what's so interesting, right? You've got all these prospectors. They come from all different places. They bring their starters. And then, the environment of San Francisco, the unique climate, the microbial life there.
yeah.
It all kind of comes together and creates what we think of as that San Francisco sourdough.
It's so cool. Like
It's kind of magical in a way.
yeah, it really is.
So we dug into, like you said, a ton of research, a ton of different sources, looked at, the history, the science, but also, importantly for you, the listener, how to overcome some of those challenges that we've all faced,
Right.
when we try to bake sourdough at home.
Because there is a pull, isn't there? It's like you see those pictures,
Oh, those gorgeous loaves, that beautiful crust, the open crumb,
kind
and
of
then you bake yours, and it's like, well, it's not quite there.
not quite there. Maybe a little dense,
A little dense, maybe. Yeah, a little flat.
flat, a little gummy.
I mean, yeah, we've all been there.
Yeah.
And it can be frustrating, right?
It can be. And so that's what
That's what we're here for.
we're gonna demystify those problems, really get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, right? Once you understand the why behind the what, it's so much easier to troubleshoot. It's so much easier to get that loaf that you're dreaming of.
So let's go back to the beginning. 1500 BC, ancient Egypt.
Pyramids.
Like, how did sourdough even happen?
We can't know for sure, but it was most likely a happy accident. You can just imagine, right? It's got these ground grains. They mix them with water, leave it out. The air back then was full of wild yeast and bacteria.
Right.
And over time, that mixture starts to ferment. They probably saw it bubbling, maybe tasted it.
I was like, whoa, what is this?
Yeah, and through trial and error, maybe some lucky mistakes, they figure out, hey, this makes our bread rise.
That's incredible.
It's amazing, and it's a testament to, human ingenuity and observation, right? Like they didn't have microscopes, they didn't know the science behind it,
Right.
but they figured it out.
And it became the staple. I mean, in Europe, it was like, that was the way to make bread.
It was. And, each region, each village, each family probably had their own little starter,
Right.
their own unique blend of these little microorganisms, and they would pass it down through generations.
And that's why you get such distinct flavors.
Yeah, exactly. Like you've got that San Francisco sourdough, which is very tangy, very sour.
Yeah.
Then you go to, parts of France and it's a little more mellow,
Right.
a little more nuanced. It's really fascinating how the environment shapes that flavor.
So then fast forward, we get to the gold rush, right? 1849,
Yeah.
San Francisco, everybody's going there. How does sourdough become so ingrained
It's such a good question.
in that city's identity? Like, what made it so perfect for that moment?
I think it's a combination of factors, right? So you've got all these prospectors, they need food, they need something reliable, and
Hmm.
sourdough, it's portable, it's hardy, it can withstand those journeys.
Hmm.
So they bring their starters, and like we talked about, those starters adapt to San Francisco's environment.
Right.
But it's also practical, right? You've got this booming population, you need to feed people.
You can't be messing around with fussy yeasts.
Exactly. Sourdough is efficient, you can make big batches of bread,
Yeah.
and it doesn't require any fancy ingredients.
So it really is a story of like practicality and adaptation.
It really is. It's, necessity is the mother of invention, and
Mhm.
sourdough really thrived in those conditions.
And you get these like iconic figures, right? Like Isidore Boudin.
Oh, yeah, Isidore Boudin, he's a legend.
Like the name Boudin, you think San Francisco sourdough, you think Boudin.
Yeah.
So he founded his bakery in 1849, right in the thick of it all.
He did, and he wasn't just a baker, he was like a custodian of that sourdough tradition.
Hmm.
He saw the value in it, the uniqueness of San Francisco sourdough and his bakery. I mean, it's still there today.
It is. It's incredible.
It's like a living link to those early sourdough days.
And then you've got, fast forward to more recent times, you've got Chad Robertson,
Chad Robertson, Tartine Baker.
the Tartine Bread book.
That book, like, changed the game for so many bakers.
Oh, yeah,
It's like the sourdough Bible, right?
it is. It's so detailed.
So detailed. He really, really, really dives deep into the nuances. And he was one of the people who really popularized this idea of using high hydration doughs and really understanding fermentation.
So he's kind of like, he took it to another level.
He did. I mean, he built on that tradition, but he also pushed the boundaries,
Yeah.
And his book, Tartine Bread, I mean, countless bakers, myself included, have been inspired by that book.
It's a great book.
It really is. It's beautiful. It's informative. It's inspiring. It's like a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And it's approachable, too. Like, even if you're a beginner baker, you can open that book and you can learn something from it.
Right. Okay, so we've got this history, we've got the appeal, but let's get into the
But
problems.
it's real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We all face them, right? We do. And I think one of the most common ones is that dense loaf.
The brick.
Yeah, the brick.
You cut into it and you're like, oh, this is...
Yeah, it's like, where are the air bubbles?
Where's the crumb?
So what's usually going on there?
So usually it's one of two things, or sometimes both.
Okay.
It's either underproofing, meaning the dough hasn't had enough time to rise and develop those lovely air pockets,
Mm-hmm.
or it's insufficient gluten development.
Okay.
The gluten is what gives the dough its structure, its strength, and it traps those gases that the yeast is producing.
So those two things are kind of like intertwined.
They are. You need both good gluten development and enough time for the yeast to do its thing.
So how do you know if your gluten has developed enough? Is there like a way to test that?
There's a really cool technique called the window pane test.
Okay.
And it's really simple. You take a little piece of dough, handle it gently, and you stretch it between your fingers. And if you can stretch it really thin, almost like a window pane,
Oh, wow.
and you can see light through it.
Okay.
And it doesn't tear, that means your gluten is strong. It's well developed.
So it's like a little membrane almost.
It is. It's like a thin, stretchy membrane.
That's so cool.
But if it tears easily, then, it needs more time, maybe more mixing, maybe more of that stretch and fold technique.
Okay, so that's a good one to remember, the window pane test. What about when your loaf just doesn't rise? Like it's flat, it's sad, it's disappointing.
Oh, the pancake loaf. Yeah, we've all been there.
What's happening there?
So usually that's a sign of a weak starter.
Okay.
Your starter, remember, is like the engine of your sourdough.
Mm-hmm.
It's what provides the yeast that makes the bread rise.
So if it's not bubbly and active.
Exactly. If it's sluggish, if it hasn't been fed properly, it's not going to have the power to lift that dough.
So how often do you need to feed your starter?
It depends, really. It depends on how active it is, how warm your kitchen is, and the type of flour you use.
Okay.
But generally, you want to feed it at least once a day, sometimes twice a day, if it's really active.
And you want to use it when it's like at its peak.
Yeah, you want to use it when it's doubled in size, full of bubbles, really active and happy.
So pay attention to your starter. It's like a little pet.
It is. It is. It needs love. It needs
It
attention.
needs to be fed.
It needs to be fed.
Okay.
And when you treat it well, it will reward you with beautiful bread.
And then there's the gummy crumb.
Ah, yes, the gummy crumb.
That dense, sticky, kind of chewy interior.
It's not what you want.
No, not at all. So why does that happen?
So usually it's one of two things. Either you're not baking it long enough, or at a high enough temperature.
Okay.
And so the starches inside the bread don't fully gelatinize and set,
Hmm.
or you're cutting into it too soon.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the bread is still baking internally even after you take it out of the oven.
Hmm?
So if you cut into it while it's still warm, all that steam gets trapped and you get that gummy texture.
So patience is key, both in the proofing and in the after the bake.
Absolutely. You've put all the time and effort into making this beautiful loaf of bread. Don't ruin it by cutting into it too soon.
Let it cool completely.
Let it cool completely.
Okay. Good advice.
On a wire rack, preferably.
On a wire rack, yes. So those are some really helpful tips. Now let's talk about some of just the fascinating things about sourdough.
Oh, I love this part.
Like, did you know that sourdough starters can live for centuries?
It's true. It's mind-blowing, right?
Like, the oldest one is supposedly 4,500 years old.
It's incredible. I mean, it's hard to verify the exact age of some of these really, really, really old starters.
Right.
But there's definitely evidence that they can be passed down for generations, for centuries.
And it's the same, like, it's the descendants of the same microorganisms?
It is. It's the same lineage. It's like a living family tree of microbes.
It's so cool.
And it speaks to their resilience, right? That their ability to adapt to different conditions, different flowers. They're just these amazing little creatures.
And then you mentioned that each starter is unique, right?
They are. They are. It's like a fingerprint, almost.
Because it's influenced by its environment.
Exactly. So the specific mix of yeasts and bacteria in your starter is going to be influenced by the air in your kitchen, the flour you use, the temperature, even the surfaces in your home.
So the air in my kitchen is contributing to the flavor of my bread.
It is. That's why sourdough from different places tastes different. You know, you've got that San Francisco sourdough, which is very distinct. But then you go to, Italy, you go to France, it's going to be a little different.
That's amazing.
It's a reflection of that place, that environment.
So, okay, for someone who's just starting out, what's the timeline? Like, what does it look like to actually bake a loaf of sourdough?
Okay, so it is a multi-day process, but don't let that scare you.
Okay.
It's actually quite straightforward once you understand the steps.
Okay.
So day one, it's all about your starter. You want to make sure your starter is active and bubbly. You're going to feed it, give it some fresh flour and water, and let it do its thing.
Okay, so you're getting the engine ready.
Exactly. You're waking it up, you're getting it ready to go.
Okay.
Day two, you're going to mix your dough. So that's flour, your water, your salt, and your active starter. And there's often a step called autolyse, which sounds fancy, but it's really just letting the flour sit with the water for about 30 minutes to an hour before you add the starter and the salt.
So it's like a pre-mixing rest.
Exactly. It just lets the flour hydrate fully, and it actually helps with gluten development.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so that's day two. Day three is all about bulk fermentation.
Okay.
This is where the magic happens, right?
Yeah.
Your dough is going to rise thanks to the yeast and bacteria in your starter, and you're going to do some gentle stretches and folds throughout the day.
Like you're actually, like, manipulating the dough?
You are, and it sounds intimidating, but it's really just, gently stretching it, folding it over itself, and it helps to build strength and structure in the dough.
Okay, so you're helping the gluten do its thing.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's day three. Day four, you're going to shape your dough. You're going to put it in a bannon, which is like a little proofing basket.
Okay.
And you're going to let it rise in the fridge overnight. This is called cold proofing.
Okay.
And the cold temperature slows down the fermentation, but it also allows for more flavor development.
Interesting. So the cold is actually doing something good.
It is. It is. It's not just about slowing things down. It's about developing those complex flavors.
Okay.
And then day five, the big day, baking.
Baking day, finally.
You're going to preheat your oven, and ideally, you're going to use a Dutch oven.
Yeah, I've heard that Dutch ovens are good for sourdough.
They are, because they trap steam, which creates a really humid environment, and that helps the bread develop a beautiful, thin, crispy crust.
So you bake it with the lid on for a while?
Yeah, for part of the bake, and then you take the lid off to let it brown and crisp up.
Okay, so it's a process, but it's not overwhelming once you break it down.
It's not. It's actually quite meditative, I find.
Yeah.
It's a nice way to slow down, connect with, this ancient tradition.
So as we kind of wrap this up, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away?
I think the most important thing is to remember that Sourdough baking is a journey.
Mhm.
It's not about perfection. It's about learning and growing with each bake.
It's about the
It's
process.
about the process, exactly. And the more you understand the science behind it,
Yeah.
how the starter works, how gluten develops, how temperature affects things, the better equipped you are to troubleshoot, to experiment, and to really make it your own.
So it's not just about following a recipe, it's about understanding it.
Exactly. It's about developing that intuition, that feel for the dough.
So it becomes more of an art than a science.
In a way, yes.
So let's just recap those troubleshooting tips one more time.
Okay, let's do it.
So dense loaf,
Underproofing,
underproofing,
gluten development,
window pane test,
window pane test,
window pane test,
Yeah.
flat loaf,
weak starter,
feed it regularly,
heat it regularly, gummy crumb,
baking time and temperature,
baking time and temperature,
and let it cool completely.
let it cool completely.
Don't cut into it too soon.
And I'm still thinking about those sourdough starters, like the fact that they can live for centuries. That's
It's
just
amazing.
amazing. And the fact that my little starter in my kitchen,
It's got its own personality.
it's got its own personality, shaped by the air, by everything around it.
It's a little ecosystem.
It really is. So to all of you out there, keep baking, keep experimenting, keep learning. Even those bakes that don't go perfectly, they're all part of the journey.
They are. They are. Embrace the mistakes, learn from them,
Mm.
and keep that starter alive and happy.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe your starter will be the one that lives for centuries.
That's the dream, isn't it?
It is.
Well, thanks for joining us on this sourdough adventure.
Yeah, happy baking, everyone.
Happy baking!